People often believe the way to deal with a narcissistic personality is to come up with the perfect comeback. They spend hours thinking about the one sentence that will finally make the other person understand, apologize, or change. That expectation usually becomes the first trap. If your goal is to force insight into someone who is committed to protecting their self-image at all costs, you'll probably leave every conversation frustrated. A more effective goal is to communicate in a way that protects your peace, preserves your credibility, and makes it much harder for the other person to pull you into an emotional game. One of the most powerful shifts you can make is to stop speaking with the hidden hope that your words will change the other person's personality. Instead, begin speaking with the intention of expressing your boundaries clearly and consistently. This changes everything, because your success is no longer measured by whether they agree. Your success is measured by whether you remained calm, clear, and aligned with your values. Imagine someone says something designed to provoke you. It might be a subtle insult disguised as humor. It might be a criticism that seems completely unrelated to the conversation. It might be an attempt to make you defend yourself over something you know isn't true. The instinctive reaction is to explain yourself. Most people immediately begin presenting evidence, offering context, or trying to prove they are being misunderstood. That instinct is understandable, but it often gives the other person exactly what they were hoping for: your emotional investment. Once you're defending yourself, the conversation is no longer about the original issue. It's about keeping you engaged. The more emotional energy you contribute, the more opportunities there are for the discussion to shift, expand, and become increasingly confusing. A calmer alternative is to acknowledge without accepting the premise. For example, if someone says, "You're always so selfish," instead of launching into a detailed defense, you might simply respond, "That's your perspective." Notice what happens. You haven't agreed. You haven't argued. You haven't invited a debate. You've recognized that the statement exists without treating it as objective reality. This kind of response removes much of the emotional fuel from the interaction. Another useful phrase is, "I'm comfortable with my decision." Simple words, but they communicate something important. You're not asking for permission. You're not negotiating your own judgment. You're letting the other person know that the decision has already been made internally. Many high-conflict conversations continue because one person believes persistence will eventually produce compliance. When your responses remain steady instead of defensive, the conversation often loses momentum. That doesn't mean the other person will immediately stop. In some situations, they may increase the pressure for a while. This is one reason consistency matters more than cleverness. A single confident sentence rarely changes a long-established relational pattern. Repeated calm responses often do. It's also helpful to notice how often emotionally manipulative conversations rely on urgency. "You need to answer me right now. If you cared, you'd decide immediately. Everyone else agrees with me." Urgency can narrow your thinking. When people feel rushed, they're more likely to react emotionally instead of thoughtfully. One powerful sentence in those moments is, "I'll think about it and let you know." This communicates two things simultaneously. First, you're not refusing to consider the issue. Second, you're deciding the timing of your response, instead of allowing someone else to dictate it. Creating space between stimulus and response is one of the most valuable communication skills you can develop. Another phrase that can be surprisingly effective is, "I'm not discussing this while we're both upset." Notice the wording. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't diagnose. It doesn't label. It simply establishes a condition for productive conversation. If the other person genuinely wants resolution, they'll eventually have an opportunity to return to the discussion. If they wanted emotional escalation instead, the lack of immediate engagement often changes the dynamic. One communication mistake many people make is believing every accusation deserves an answer. Not every statement requires a rebuttal. Not every criticism deserves your attention. Not every misunderstanding needs immediate correction. Learning to distinguish between important issues and emotional bait can conserve an enormous amount of mental energy. Suppose someone repeatedly says, "You're too sensitive." You could spend 20 minutes explaining why their behavior was hurtful. Or you could calmly respond, "We're seeing this differently." That sentence doesn't surrender your perspective. It simply refuses to enter an argument over whose emotional experience is objectively correct. Healthy communication allows two people to describe different experiences without demanding complete agreement. Another practical habit is asking yourself a quiet internal question before responding. What outcome am I trying to create? If your answer is, "I want them to finally admit they're wrong," you're replacing your emotional well-being in someone else's hands. If your answer is, I want to communicate clearly and respectfully, that's something you can actually control. This distinction matters because control over your own behavior is almost always more reliable than attempting to control someone else's reactions. Body language also influences these interactions. People often focus exclusively on the words they should use while overlooking the signals. Their posture, facial expressions, and tone communicate. Speaking slowly, maintaining relaxed breathing, avoiding sudden movements driven by frustration, keeping your volume consistent. These behaviors reinforce the message that you're not being pulled into emotional turbulence. Calmness should never be confused with passivity. A calm person can say no. A calm person can leave a conversation. A calm person can enforce consequences. Calmness simply means your decisions are not being driven by panic or emotional contagion. Another phrase worth remembering is, I'm not willing to continue this conversation if we're insulting each other. Notice that this isn't a threat. It's a condition. If the condition isn't met, the conversation ends. Boundaries become meaningful when they describe your own actions rather than attempting to control another person's behavior. Compare these two statements. You need to stop yelling, versus, if the yelling continues, I'm going to leave this conversation. The second statement focuses on what you will do. That makes it clearer, more realistic, and easier to follow through on. One of the strongest forms of confidence is predictability. People learn what to expect from you. They discover that you don't explode one day and surrender the next. Your responses become consistent enough that emotional manipulation becomes less rewarding. Over time, many interactions begin changing not because you've found magical words, but because you've become a more stable communicator. It's also useful to recognize the difference between explanation and over-explanation. An explanation shares information. An over-explanation often reflects anxiety about whether your decision will be accepted. Consider these responses. I won't be available Saturday, or I'm so sorry. The reason is that I have several things happening, and I wasn't sure, and maybe I could move something if. The second response unintentionally invites negotiation. The first communicates a completed decision. This doesn't mean you should become cold or dismissive. Kindness and firmness can exist together. Respect and boundaries are not opposites. In fact, they're often strongest when combined. Sometimes the most effective words are remarkably ordinary. I understand. I've heard your opinion. I'm making a different choice. We'll have to disagree. I'm leaving now. These statements aren't dramatic. They aren't designed to dominate another person. They're designed to help you remain grounded. When conversations become emotionally intense, simple language is often more effective than elaborate arguments. Complex explanations create more opportunities for misunderstanding, distraction, and debate. Clear sentences reduce ambiguity. Perhaps the most important shift is recognizing that genuine confidence doesn't require winning every conversation. It doesn't require having the final word. It doesn't require convincing everyone you're right. Real confidence is demonstrated by your ability to stay connected to your principles even when someone else wants to pull you away from them. That's why communication isn't just about vocabulary. It's about emotional discipline. The words matter. The timing matters. The delivery matters. But underneath all of those is something even more important. The quiet decision that your self-respect will no longer depend on another person's approval, agreement, or emotional reactions. One of the most overlooked realities in difficult relationships is that people reveal their priorities through the conversations they repeatedly create. If nearly every discussion turns into a contest over control, blame, or emotional leverage, stop assuming each incident is isolated. Instead of asking, how do I win this argument? Begin asking, what pattern am I participating in? That single question changes your perspective because it shifts your attention from individual moments to recurring dynamics. Patterns become powerful because they are familiar. Familiarity often feels normal, even when it is unhealthy. You may become so accustomed to explaining yourself, defending every decision, or anticipating criticism that you stop recognizing how exhausting those habits have become. Once you see the pattern, however, you gain something valuable, the ability to interrupt it. Interrupting a pattern doesn't always require dramatic confrontation. In many cases, it requires predictable consistency. Suppose every disagreement follows the same sequence. The other person criticizes. You defend yourself. They move to a different accusation. You defend that. Hours pass, nothing is resolved, and you leave feeling mentally drained. Now imagine changing only one part of that sequence. Instead of defending every accusation, you respond with, I understand that's how you see it. Then you stop talking. Silence can feel uncomfortable because many people instinctively try to fill it. Yet silence often communicates confidence more effectively than lengthy explanations. It shows you are not rushing to repair someone else's opinion of you. This doesn't mean silence is always the answer. It means intentional silence can prevent you from becoming trapped in endless, circular conversations. Another useful question to ask yourself is, am I answering the real issue, or am I responding to an emotional hook? Not every statement deserves equal attention. Imagine someone says, "You're impossible to deal with." At first glance, it appears to be criticism. But what practical information does it actually contain? Very little. It's a broad emotional statement, rather than a specific observation. Compare that with something like, "When our meeting started late, I felt frustrated because I had another appointment." That statement can be discussed. The first one mostly invites emotional defense. Learning to distinguish between vague attacks and specific concerns helps you decide where your energy is best invested. One communication habit that strengthens your position is asking for clarification instead of assuming intent. If someone says, "You never support me," you might calmly ask, "What specific situation are you referring to?" This accomplishes several things. It slows the pace of the conversation. It encourages concrete examples instead of sweeping accusations. It also demonstrates that you're willing to discuss facts rather than generalizations. Sometimes the person provides a specific concern that can actually be addressed. Other times, they continue making increasingly broad statements. That difference tells you something important about the nature of the discussion. Another phrase that often keeps conversations productive is "let's stay with one topic." High-conflict conversations frequently expand. A disagreement about today becomes an argument about last month, then last year, then your personality, then your family, then something completely unrelated. This expansion creates confusion. When too many issues are introduced simultaneously, none of them receive thoughtful attention. Bringing the conversation back to one subject isn't about controlling the other person. It's about protecting clarity. Clarity reduces emotional chaos. Something else worth remembering is that emotionally charged interactions often reward immediate reactions and punish thoughtful responses. That's exactly why slowing down is so valuable. There's no prize for answering first. There's enormous value in answering carefully. If you need a moment to think, say so. "I'd like a few minutes before I respond." That sentence demonstrates self-control rather than avoidance. Many people assume confidence means always having an immediate answer. In reality, confidence is often comfortable with thoughtful pauses. Another mistake people make is trying to correct every inaccurate statement. Imagine someone exaggerates something that happened. You immediately interrupt. You correct one detail, then another. Soon you're debating minor facts while the larger issue disappears. This is sometimes called getting pulled into the weeds. Not every factual error changes the outcome of the conversation. Choose carefully which points truly matter. Accuracy is important. Perspective is equally important. Think of your attention as a limited resource. Every conversation costs something. Time, mental energy, emotional focus. Ask yourself whether the conversation is moving toward understanding or simply consuming those resources. If it's the second, you may need to end it respectfully. One sentence that reflects this idea is, "I don't think we're making progress right now." Notice that it doesn't assign blame. It simply describes the situation. From there, you might suggest continuing later or deciding not to continue at all. Respectful disengagement is different from avoidance. Avoidance refuses necessary conversations. Respectful disengagement recognizes when productive conversation is no longer happening. Your tone also deserves attention. Research on interpersonal communication consistently suggests that people respond not only to the content of words, but also to how those words are delivered. A calm tone reduces unnecessary escalation. A sarcastic tone often increases defensiveness. The same sentence can produce very different reactions depending on pace, volume, and emotional expression. This is one reason emotional regulation matters so much. You cannot always choose another person's behavior. You can influence the climate you create. Another important principle is resisting the urge to prove your worth during conflict. When someone questions your character, competence, or intentions, the impulse to defend yourself can become overwhelming. Yet constantly proving yourself creates an exhausting cycle. Healthy relationships don't require endless demonstrations of your value. Mutual respect allows room for occasional misunderstandings, without turning every moment's disagreement into a referendum on your character. A phrase that reflects quiet confidence is, "I know my reasons." Not everyone needs access to every internal decision you've made. Privacy is not dishonesty. Boundaries are not secrecy. You are allowed to keep parts of your decision-making process private when appropriate. One subtle but significant change involves replacing reactive questions with curious questions. Instead of saying, "Why are you always doing this?" try asking, "What outcome are you hoping for here?" Sometimes that question reveals assumptions. Sometimes it reveals misunderstandings. Sometimes it reveals that the other person hasn't considered their own goals at all. Questions have a way of slowing emotional momentum. They invite reflection instead of immediate opposition. That doesn't guarantee cooperation, but it often improves the quality of the interaction. Remember, too, that consistency creates credibility. If your boundaries change every time someone becomes upset, they stop functioning as boundaries. Consistency doesn't require rigidity. It requires reliability. People learn that your words and actions align. That alignment builds self-respect from the inside out. Over time, you'll probably notice another change. You stop feeling the need to rehearse conversations for hours afterward. You stop replaying every sentence in your mind. You stop wondering whether you should have argued longer or explained more thoroughly. Why? Because your goal has shifted. Instead of trying to control another person's conclusions, you're focused on communicating with honesty, clarity, and respect. That's a standard you can actually meet. Ironically, when people stop chasing approval, they often appear more confident. Not because they've become louder, not because they've become more intimidating, but because their emotional center is no longer moving with every opinion expressed around them. That kind of steadiness tends to influence conversations in ways dramatic speeches rarely do. It communicates that your boundaries are not temporary reactions. They are stable parts of who you are. And when your words consistently match your behavior, your communication becomes easier to trust by others, but just as importantly, by yourself. One of the clearest signs that your communication is becoming stronger is that you stop feeling responsible for managing every emotion in the room. Many people grow accustomed to believing that if someone else becomes angry, disappointed, or offended, it automatically means they have done something wrong. That assumption creates an impossible burden because it places your sense of peace under the pressure of control of another person's reactions. There is an important difference between causing unnecessary harm and allowing another adult to experience emotions they dislike. Healthy relationships include disagreement. They include moments of disappointment. They include boundaries that are not always welcomed. The presence of another person's frustration does not automatically mean your decision was unfair. This realization changes the way you speak. Instead of saying, "I'm sorry you made me do this," you simply say, "This is the decision I've made." Instead of saying, "Please understand why I had no choice," you say, "I've thought this through carefully." Notice the difference. The first version seeks permission. The second communicates ownership. Ownership is one of the strongest signals of confidence. People tend to trust individuals who appear comfortable accepting responsibility for their own choices. That doesn't mean stubbornness. It means clarity. Another pattern worth recognizing is emotional forecasting. Sometimes a difficult person will predict catastrophic outcomes if you don't comply. If you don't agree with me, everyone will turn against you. If you leave now, you'll regret it forever. No one else will ever put up with you. Statements like these attempt to replace thoughtful decision-making with fear. Rather than arguing over each prediction, it is often more productive to return to the present. I understand that's your prediction. Then stop. You don't need to debate the future. No one can verify it in the present moment. When people lose confidence, they often begin borrowing certainty from whoever sounds the most convinced. Confident delivery, however, is not the same as accurate thinking. Someone can express complete certainty while being completely mistaken. That's why emotionally healthy communication depends more on evidence and consistency than volume and conviction. One practical habit is separating observations from interpretations. Suppose someone didn't answer your message. The observation is simple. They didn't reply. The interpretation might be, "They're ignoring me. They're trying to punish me. They don't respect me." Those interpretations may or may not be true. When conversations become emotionally charged, interpretations often masquerade as facts. Learning to distinguish between the two helps you stay grounded. The same principle applies when someone is speaking to you. Listen carefully for what was actually said. Then notice what your mind immediately adds. That brief pause can prevent countless misunderstandings. Another phrase that protects clarity is, "Let's stick to what we know." This keeps discussions anchored in observable reality, rather than assumptions about motives. Motives are difficult to prove. Behaviors are easier to discuss. For example, you interrupted me 3 times. That's observable. You interrupted me because you think you're superior. That's an interpretation. The first statement invites discussion. The second often invites defensiveness. One communication skill that rarely receives enough attention is recognizing when agreement isn't necessary. Many conversations continue long after the important information has already been exchanged. At some point, both people understand each other's positions. They're no longer exchanging information. They're competing for agreement. Those are very different activities. Once you've communicated your position clearly, repeating it 10 more times usually doesn't make it more persuasive. Instead, it often increases frustration. Sometimes the strongest sentence is simply, "I think we understand each other's perspectives." That sentence acknowledges completion. Agreement may never come. Understanding is often enough. Another helpful mindset is remembering that boundaries are primarily about access. They answer questions like, how much time will I spend in this conversation? What behavior am I willing to remain around? What topics am I prepared to discuss? What happens if those limits aren't respected? Notice that all of those questions concern your behavior. They don't require controlling another person. This makes boundaries far more practical. You can't reliably control another adult. You can reliably choose how you'll respond. Another common trap is confusing emotional intensity with importance. Some people express every issue with maximum urgency. Every disagreement becomes a crisis. Every inconvenience becomes an emergency. If you respond to everything as though it's equally important, you'll eventually become exhausted. Instead, ask yourself, will this matter next week? Will this matter next month? Does this issue deserve today's energy? Those questions create perspective. Perspective helps regulate emotion. Something else to consider is the role of predictability. When your responses become predictable in a healthy way, manipulation becomes less effective. Imagine someone tries 3 different approaches: criticism, guilt, anger. Each time, your response remains respectful, brief, and consistent. Eventually, they receive the same message regardless of the strategy. That consistency changes the interaction because emotional unpredictability is no longer available as leverage. One phrase that reflects this stability is, "My answer hasn't changed." No anger, no elaborate justification, no hostility, just consistency. Consistency often communicates confidence more effectively than intensity ever could. It's also useful to notice how often people explain themselves after they've already made a decision. For example, "I can't attend." Silence. Many people become uncomfortable with that silence, so they continue talking. "I mean, unless you really need me. I guess I could rearrange things. I'm probably being selfish." Without realizing it, they begin negotiating against themselves. The original boundary becomes weaker with every unnecessary sentence. This is why brevity is such an important communication skill. Short responses reduce opportunities for confusion. They also reduce opportunities for emotional pressure. Another powerful habit is becoming comfortable with unanswered questions. Not every accusation requires investigation. Not every misunderstanding needs immediate resolution. Not every opinion deserves your attention. The desire for complete closure can sometimes keep people trapped in conversations that stopped being productive long ago. Closure isn't always something another person gives you. Sometimes it's a decision you make. I've said what I needed to say. That can be enough. One final shift begins happening as these habits become part of your daily life. You stop evaluating every interaction based on whether someone liked your response. Instead, you begin asking different questions. Was I respectful? Was I honest? Did I communicate clearly? Did my actions match my values? Those questions gradually build a deeper form of confidence because the answers depend on your louvre rather than another person's approval. Over time, people often notice something surprising. The conversations themselves become less intimidating, not necessarily because everyone around them has changed, but because they no longer feel compelled to win every argument, defend every criticism, or rescue every misunderstanding. They've learned that calm communication isn't about controlling other people. It's about remaining steady enough that your principles continue guiding your behavior even when someone else is trying to pull the conversation in a different direction. That steadiness doesn't develop overnight. It's built one interaction at a time. One thoughtful pause, one clear boundary, one respectful refusal, one calm response after another. Eventually, those individual moments become habits. Those habits become your reputation. And your reputation for clarity, consistency, and emotional stability often speaks long before you say your next sentence.